Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's ACA Connects Vendor Solutions webinar presented by CCI Systems. I'm Tamika Slappy, ACA Connects Manager of Member Services. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available within 24 hours in the Members Lounge section of our website. If you have a question during today's presentation, we encourage you to please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature, and the team will get to your questions during the Q&A segment. Now, for a few words, allow me to turn it over to Bill Tortorello, ACA Connect's Vice President of Technology and Policy. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Tamika. And I'm always encouraged when people get my name right. So thank you for that. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's ACA Connects Vendor Solutions webinar. I'm Bill Tortorello, ACA Connects VP of Technology and Policy, and I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event. Today's session, presented by CCI Systems, focuses on one of the most important and sometimes underappreciated elements of Bead compliance, and that's cybersecurity. So whether you're just beginning to assess your organization's cybersecurity posture or are already drafting formal policies, this webinar will help you understand what you're attesting to in your Bead application and what that commitment means in practice. That checkbox on cybersecurity isn't just procedural. It signals a responsibility to implement a plan that aligns with federal expectations, particularly those tied to the NIST cybersecurity framework. At ACA Connects, we continue to actively collaborate with the NTIA and state broadband offices to ensure the implementation of Bead is feasible and realistic for small and mid-sized providers. We believe our members will appreciate the flexibility in cybersecurity documentation, which will assist them in understanding the requirements and how to fulfill them. Today's discussion aims to provide practical guidance to help you structure a cybersecurity plan that meets both compliance requirements and the realities of your operations. We'll keep this session to about 45 minutes, and you are encouraged to submit your questions via the Q&A portal at any time. With that, I'll turn it over to Roger, our lead moderator from CCI Systems, to get us started. Roger?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bill. Appreciate it. I have the same issue with my last name as well, so I can appreciate that when someone nails it. So thank you very much. So thank you to all of you who have taken the time to join us today. We very much appreciate you carving out the time, and we certainly appreciate ACA Connects for this opportunity for sure. As Bill said, my name is Roger Pascal. I'm head of Global Alliances for CCI Systems and GuideStar. And so you probably know by now, the BEAD program, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, is the U.S. government's largest ever broadband investment initiative, over $40 billion allocated to close the digital divide. Its purpose is to ensure every American, particularly those that are unserved or underserved, have access to, reliable, high-speed internet. So today, as Bill said, we're going to zero in on a very specific portion of this program, which is cybersecurity. And cybersecurity is one of the more challenging areas of the grant funding process. And CCI's division, GuideStar, I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, can assist with this, this very specific element, and help ensure that you meet requirements which are critical for the grant process, and that cybersecurity issues, don't hinder your success in terms of funds. And we can assist you no matter really where you are in the process, depending on, whatever your level of understanding is or your current security posture might be. We can identify gaps and map your current processes, help you with documentation, help create a roadmap for necessary improvements if need be, and ultimately, kind of just help you implement a plan to ensure compliance and, receipt of your grant funds. So we're going to dive into this. And as Bill said, there's an opportunity for interactive Q&A here, and we'll address that later on in the presentation. But as you have questions or questions come up, you can put them in the chat and we'll address them. We've got time at the end to do that. Let me dive into some introductions first. We have some speakers here. And first off, let me introduce Evan Rice. So Evan is our Senior Vice President and Business Leader at GuideStar. He's at the center of everything we're going to be talking today and leads the teams that do the great work that we're going to be sharing. Also, Tim Malone, really great to have Tim here. He is Chief Executive Officer for Cherry Capital Connection. He's going to give, I think, a really neat perspective on the journey he went through And then really great to have Eric Frederick here, talk about perspective. So the Chief Connectivity Officer for Michigan High Speed Internet Office, great perspective from his point of view as well. So exciting to hear kind of what he has to say. So let me I think if you can go to the next slide here, please. Make sure. Yeah, there you go. So before we fully dive into all of the meat of this, as I mentioned a minute ago, let me talk about who CCI Systems and GuideStar are. And I think the best way to just make it perfectly clear is we're actually the same. It's the same thing. GuideStar is really just an arm, a part of CCI. So as many of you probably know, if you're familiar with CCI, CCI for like over 60 years has been operating and managing complex networks and systems, and has really become one of the top engineering and design and consulting firms in the US. We service telecom, cable, power, gas, wireless, electric, all over the country. And we help them plan and design and upgrade and grow networks and infrastructure. And, as we were talking yesterday, I think it's important to understand, CCI definitely delivers turnkey services. It's really everything from walkouts to build outs to as-builts and design, engineering, permitting, splicing, GIS modeling. We do it all. And along the way, GuideStar was created as really a way to house some of our advanced managed services solutions. So GuideStar is just an arm of CCI, and both GuideStar and CCI support customers when it comes to grant writing needs, particularly Bead, and GuideStar simply focuses on specifically cybersecurity elements. And that's what we're here to discuss today. So before we get further into that discussion, if we can move to the next slide here, so this poll question, this is really an opportunity for us to understand where everyone stands, so we can kind of tailor our information on the call and just have an opportunity for you to share kind of what you think or where you think you currently stand in terms of your own readiness to implement NIST controls and manage cybersecurity requirements. So if you could put in there where you think you stand, 1 through 5, 1 meaning I'm totally on the deep end of the pool. I have no idea what I'm doing and I've done nothing so far. To 5 is, we've got a lot of documentation going. We just need perhaps some help with a few gaps. So 1 through 5. 1 being we've not done anything, and 5, we're just here for some additional policy pieces. Give everybody a second to respond here. Hopefully the poll is working. On my end is showing no responses, so hopefully we'll see a refresh here. Okay, excellent. Look at that. We've got folks really across the spectrum. Most folks, as you might imagine, appear to be in the middle. More than 50% are in the middle, and we've got some folks who will appear to be well down the road as well. So excellent. All right. Well, thank you for providing that information. That's useful to us. As I said, helps us kind of tailor our conversation to the audience. So thank you very much. Next slide, if you could, please. Okay. So let me get my my slide going here. Let's introduce our first speaker here today. And as I mentioned, it's Tim Malone, and Tim has been on a cybersecurity journey in the past. Tim is CEO of Cherry Capital Connections. And Tim, first of all, again, thank you for joining the call. But if you could just share with us a little bit about the process you went through, the journey, what brought you to CCI GuideStar, and what you discovered, maybe a little bit about the outcomes, and just what you learned along the way.
Yeah, Roger, thanks for inviting me to participate. I appreciate that. Cherry Capital Connection is a regional telephone company growing and focusing on the unserved and underserved households in northern Michigan. We call it above the knuckles. If you look at your hand, you'll understand why. We own and operate our own fiber plant, and we transitioned from wireless to fiber 5 or 6 years ago. So that we have multiple journeys for our company. We're also an open access platform. And through that, we just recently acquired the contract to build and oversee a 100-mile fiber plant for the Sioux tribe in the Upper Peninsula. They're the fourth largest tribe with about 51,000 members. And we've also participate in a number of different programs, RDOF, Robin, ARPA, and we have also recently made application for Bead, which, as most people know, is now going to be redone under the bargain round. So we're getting ready for that. A total of about 60 million in projects right now we're managing. So that's, and I mention all that just so you know the scope of our size of our company and how that affects what we're doing. We started, because of Bead, we started looking at cybersecurity. Up until that point, we thought it was just a network and maybe a nuisance. And so we reached out to our current partners, and one of those partners is CCI Systems. They now do 99% of all of our engineering. We still do a little bit on small projects internally, but we offloaded that as we grow to CCI over the last few years, and they've done a great job. And when we asked about cybersecurity, they introduced us to GuideStar. Along that journey, we did interview a number of other cybersecurity companies, but we felt that we had a long-term relationship with CCI. The culture matches our culture very well. So after interviewing GuideStar, we felt that they had a similar culture. They aligned very well. So the journey should be an easy journey. And we knew nothing about NIST 2.0, so it was really outside of our knowledge base. So anyway, so I'm looking at my notes to make sure I didn't miss something. Sorry about that. So as we selected them, they clearly demonstrated their knowledge. They simplified it, gave it as a checklist, so we could follow along with it, and that was appreciated. It is a big commitment. I think we had 4 of our team attend 6 different sessions that were hour-long sessions. It's broken down into 6 different groups with over 100 analytical points that we had to go through. What was interesting is that when it all was done, we weren't that far off. Our main issue was documentation, which is probably pretty common across the board. But NIST is very much a standard that I would think most in the network business follow. They just don't realize that they're following the NIST standard. So yeah, that was comforting that we're actually documenting now what we've done. And it also reinforced where we were going. Part of our NIST analysis said that we should consider moving to Office 365 and get into a SharePoint because being able to secure and control who sees the files and to create a standard as to how we communicate internally versus externally. And we're already on that path. So along with the analysis, along with the roadmap, GuideStar was also able to come in and help our IT staff convert from a couple of different methods, Dropbox and others, and convert our data, help us through that process. And now we're on Office 365. So with this process, we find we can do it in small chunks and make progress without getting overwhelmed. And how prepared are we today? I think we are. We've defined where we're at. We defined where we're going. And we've also discovered that cybersecurity is well beyond the funding. Cybersecurity and going through this process will help us whether whether there's another funding program or not. And the one piece that we took from their analysis was we then created an action plan. Their analysis was so detailed, it was pretty easy for us to transition from an analysis to a plan. And we plan on a regular basis getting back with GuideStar and making sure we're staying on track, much like you do with a strategic plan for your company. So we're happy to have this relationship. And thank you, Roger, for all that you guys have done.
That's well, appreciate it, Tim. Thank you very much for the feedback and sort of sharing the journey that you went through in that process. And we certainly appreciate your consideration of GuideStar without a doubt. It's interesting to hear you talk about how you went into it with not a lot of knowledge. And what you kind of came out with it is maybe some peace of mind, reinforcing the fact that you guys are already on the right path towards success in terms of your security posture. And you also kind of found out that it's kind of an ongoing thing, what, grant process or not. It's a sort of an important element to the business. So that's really, it aligns well with what we see other customers go through as well. So it's great feedback. So thank you. So let's switch to our next speaker here. And let me introduce Evan Rice, our SVP here at GuideStar. And so it's a good spot to have Evan here because you just kind of heard a journey someone went through with their own business and sort of the discovery process and what all that turned into. Evan's at the center of all of that goes on here at GuideStar, helping customers through that journey. And so, Evan, share with us a little bit about what the actual process looks like. Tim alluded to it a little bit, and just provide us some color around the process. What's an engagement look like, and maybe some of the benefits just in general of developing a cybersecurity plan, with or without a grant process.
Sure. Thanks, Roger. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to talk about this. I think important is kind of why GuideStar and CCI created the cybersecurity component to our grant application. And it's really because as we're working in the industry as long as we have, and we're leaning into the customer base, as programs like EACAM that had a small cybersecurity component wrapped up, and as Bead came announced, there was this mandate for cybersecurity for the first time that kind of came out with Bead. And we were finding that many of the groups that were doing grant writing services, this was a gap for them. And CCI participates in that model, and we wanted it to be that comprehensive approach where if you're looking at a grant writing service, we can handle each piece. And my team at GuideStar handles a lot of cybersecurity compliance for other industries across our customer base. We work in the service provider and the telecommunications space, but we also service a lot of small to medium enterprises, small business, and that have varying regulatory requirements of different aspects. So we were sort of tasked with coming back and kind of leveraging some of those strengths to build out this Bead program. And what we found is that maybe more than any other group we've ever worked with, from a cybersecurity standpoint, operators are awesome at practical security. Like Tim alluded to, they're doing a lot of the blocking and tackling. They're not great at compliance from a documentation standpoint and being able sort of to prove that they're doing the things or understanding how to align to a framework. And that's where you were right, Tim. That not having the documentation aspect of it is something we see a lot. So we recognized that pretty early, and we said we don't need to make this over the top then, because they know how to do this stuff. We just need to figure out where their gaps are. So our process looks at NIST CSF 2.0, and NIST, for those of you that aren't familiar, is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So it's the group within the United States that aligns any kind of standardized framework in the technology space. It's really where the United States is landing from an overarching what is going to control cybersecurity in the US. There are some other international standards. There's some private standards like SOC 2 and Type 2 and others, but NIST is really where anything within the government framework from a regulatory standpoint is happening. And when the Bead announcement first came out, there were a handful of different NIST-based requirements. There was, NIST CSF, 1.0. There was the, Executive Order 14028. There was the supply chain components, which is a different aspect of NIST. And it was really hard to combine all of that. And so thankfully, what happened in fairly short order after that is NIST CSF 2.0 came out. And that's the framework that combined all of those things into one sort of rule of truth for where the grading rubric would be on your cybersecurity program for BEAD. So we're happy to see that NIST aligned to that. It simplified things, it aggregated a few things, it removed a lot of redundancy that made it even harder to navigate. And so what happens with our program, and I think where it's really valuable, is we go in and we look at the assessment standpoint. So like Tim said, we go through a series of reviews and meetings and scans where we look at all the practical things you're doing, and we walk you through those control families. And I'll get to those in a minute. When we're done walking through those, what you have is you have a standardized policy that's future state. So this is the policy that you will align to when your gaps are remediated. And we call out what those gaps are so that you have that, you can create that action plan, that implementation plan. And then the last piece, which is a little different than most of the other grant writers, a lot of the other grant writing programs, if they do have a cybersecurity piece, you kind of stop at the gap assessment. And because GuideStar is we're not just a reviewer of this, we do practical cybersecurity implementation. So we have some pretty deep knowledge and expertise on what it actually takes to implement these things. So helping build out a budget for that was sort of the last piece. And we do that very high level. We assume third parties so that you've got, and that way when you're submitting for your BEAD application, you can be really tight on funding requests to help have the grant program help implementing some of these controls as you're rolling through. So it's really about that assessment, the gap deliverable, explaining all that, making sure everybody understands, and then the budget piece. Those are the kind of the three deliverables that we roll through. Kind of getting in a little bit more into the CSF 2.0, if we could go to the next slide. There's 6 what we call control families within there are functions within NIST CSF 2.0, and they're all sort of around, most of them, the first family, the govern family there, that's really that's the compliance piece. This is where we find generally the most gap for most of our service provider, telco, and telecommunications customers. They're very good at the practical aspects of it, of having asset management, looking at their platform security, monitoring. Service providers have to monitor all the time, right? Customer outages, you're monitoring those networks, you're looking at those things. Incident management, knowing what you're going to do if the worst were to happen, is another area where we tend to find opportunity to increase and improve processes, procedures, and tools. And the recovery plans, again, service providers are awesome at recovery because they're dealing with outages and whether it be physical, a lightning strike, or somebody gets carried away with an excavator, they got to go out and get a fiber splicer in there. So those recovery plans they often have, it's just a slight adjustment to work into a cybersecurity context from what they're already so good at operationally. So within these, you've got the families with those, which is the 6 main categories, and there's subcategories in there. And like Tim said, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 125 individual subcontrols that are in these. And the beauty of NIST is that it's widely applicable, and the danger of NIST is that it's widely applicable. There's often things that don't map perfectly to any particular business's context. So understanding the purpose of that control, what your mitigating factor could be, or how you're going to resolve that, and how to document that so it's acceptable and aligns, is something that can be fairly open to interpretation. And it's something that we can help align to as we go through those sessions, where it's like, oh, okay, that's how you're doing that. That makes sense. We can adjust this in your policy here to call that out, so it's very clear to everybody who's looking at that. I could definitely run down some of these and get really technical and help people understand. If anybody, I'd encourage you to. I'm not going to do that though, because I know from an audience standpoint, we're going to try to keep it high level, and we don't have a week and a half. But if you do have any questions about particular control families or categories, please feel free to put them in the Q&A when we get to that section. I'll do my best to try to be brief and answer those, or even follow up with you after. Happy to talk about any of these in depth. So that's kind of the overview of the NIST CSF. And then if we can jump to the next slide, I want to talk about the timing. There's many of the application processes to submit your application or your pre-application. You just have to sort of a test that says, hey, if I get awarded this funds, I'm going to align to NIST CSF 2.0. And maybe, you know, the areas where you could enter a budget line item for it or something like that. The danger there is if you check that box, you're committing to doing that, and you may not have all the information you need to understand what it is you're committing to. So I'm a big proponent of doing this type of assessment and having these policies and procedures and plan and your framework and your roadmap in place and understanding your gaps in your budget before you check that box. There's huge value to, you know, driving those changes in parallel as you're building out your extensions and not having to come back later and identify the technologies and be looking for vendors. It's going to be hard to find those people. Network engineers are busy guys, and so are sysadmins and server resources, and putting all these controls in place while you're doing a major construction project can be time consuming, and it's all got to be kind of finished at once. So I think there's some really good advantages as far as driving down the compliance risks and potentially disqualification further on down the road, or you know, penalties for non-alignment or any of those types of things. I'm not positive on what those look like. Maybe something Eric could touch on when he goes through and what that looks like from an ongoing compliance standpoint. But then also from a strategic positioning and competitive advantage, if you know, if you've got a better plan to align to NIST, you're more thoughtful there, you're going to be able to leverage those things more fully as your scale. And then also the financial piece, just knowing the cost of what you're committing to. We've worked with some customers on this where they come back and the gap assessment's done and they've got maybe $85,000 they've got to spend to just tighten everything up. And then there's others, we come back and it's, you know, 300,000, 400,000 north because they're just missing a lot of technical aspects and things that they're going to have to implement. And those timelines tend to stretch too when that happens. I think also the big advantage of this is not something you're going to have to do every time. Cybersecurity is a journey. This first step along the process enables you to leverage this as you move forward. Cybersecurity it's become table stakes for grant writing programs in the United States, I believe. I don't think we're going to see another grant program where there's not a cybersecurity aspect to it moving forward. So getting this done now, so you have this, you're managing these programs, gives you the ability to check that box and get that funding and move forward. I think also there's a lot of value to cybersecurity for the sake of cybersecurity outside of gaining access to funds. It's going to help with resiliency and uptime. You know, teaming with us can get you that comprehensive package for your BEAD program as well. Cybersecurity is a piece of that, but working with someone else to guide you through the whole process creates that comprehensive view that can be really attractive for people who are looking at those grading rubrics. And I think it can, in some ways, it can create a real competitive advantage for you. If your systems are more secure and your system's up and you've got competitors in your areas or other options and you're managing this better, there's going to be more of a piece to that. And then I think the other part too, and this hasn't happened yet, but you know, the writing's on the wall, is how as more and more telecommunications infrastructure service provider companies are, you know, looking at becoming sort of critical infrastructure from a communication standpoint in the United States and what that means from a regulatory standpoint and where that line is coming. You see that in power, you see that in water, you see that in lots of different areas. The regulatory oversight, cybersecurity is a concern there, and the internet is how we communicate now. And there's aspects to that that are going to stay true for a long time. So really strong benefits for having a plan early and moving forward.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Evan. Very much appreciate it. Great information. And like you said, if folks have questions, there's going to be an opportunity here or even outside of this call to address those questions. I love the idea that you raised, though, where it's just beyond just helping a customer understand what their gaps are, but also understanding what the cost is going to be to fill those gaps, and then ultimately have the grant program help compensate for some of those gaps. So makes perfect sense when you hear you lay it out like that. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, we have our next speaker here. I'm excited to introduce. We have Eric Frederick. Eric is Chief Connectivity Officer for the Michigan High Speed Internet Office, and we're really excited to have him here because it's a different perspective than you've heard so far on the call. And Eric, it'd be great if you could just chat with us a little bit about that perspective related,
Yeah.
specifically to cybersecurity, grant funding, and why is it important, and maybe important in terms of building trust most of all.
Yeah, I mean that was going to be the first topic to address was trust. But in the great words of Monty Python, and now for something completely different, you're right. It's a different perspective shift here, right? That we have at the state of Michigan when we're implementing BEAD. So my office does implement Michigan's $1.6 billion BEAD allocation. And that is no small task. But I think you're right, Roger, that it does start with trust in that, as we look to build out these networks with taxpayer dollars, we want to make sure and ensure that Michiganders are safe online, right? There's a difference obviously between cybersecurity and cyber safety, the consumer level, cyber safety and things that can be done to stay safe online. But we want to make sure that those residents and businesses and institutions that are connecting to these networks um, can have that trust in that connection. Right now that we're building all these networks and we are connecting folks who have either had a extremely slow experience with the internet in the past or no experience at all. We want them to be able to trust these networks that are being built, and that's why those cybersecurity requirements are there. So in BEAD, obviously, June 6th brought us a whole new world of BEAD with the release of a BEAD restructuring policy notice from the NTIA. And while there are many changes to the BEAD program that are found in that policy notice, the cybersecurity requirements are not one of those. So it was nice to continue to see that focus on cybersecurity going forward. And there's really four main requirements in this for the cybersecurity plan when it comes to BEAD. So any prospective subgrantee in BEAD has to have this, what we've been talking about here, the cybersecurity risk management plan in place that is, operational and in service prior to the award of the grant or is ready to be operationalized. So Evan, like you said, and what the survey showed at the beginning, that there's some folks that have already gone down this path and are starting to and developing these things, and some that are just starting that process. So, everybody's kind of at a different place, but when it comes to BEAD, that risk management plan has to either be already operational or ready to be operationalized if an entity becomes a subgrantee in the BEAD program. Obviously, we've been talking about the NIST standards quite a bit, so it does have to reflect that latest version of that NIST framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. So I love seeing all the detail on that. I'm not a cybersecurity expert by any means, so I love seeing and hearing all of this and giving me, even greater insight into that world as we're implementing the BEAD program and have many, many different pieces and parts that we're working on in the BEAD program. And Evan, I think you touched on this too, in that this plan needs to be reevaluated and updated on a periodic basis, right? It's not a static thing. It's going to evolve over time as threats continue to evolve over time. So we need to make sure that that plan follows suit and is adaptable to make sure that it can be reevaluated and updated. The plan also does need to be submitted to the state, the eligible entity, the territory, wherever you might be applying, prior to the allocation of funds. So we handled this in our pre-registration portion of the BEAD project here in Michigan. Other states have different approaches to this, but we did ask for that information during pre-registration. And if it wasn't available then, or it wasn't fully fleshed out at that time, that's something we just have to have in hand as we move into becoming a subgrantee, if that's the path that's taken. Evan, you mentioned a little bit about non-compliance and making sure that those plans are implemented and on the books. And so, that would be likely handled in a grant agreement for those BEAD funds, and making sure that those subgrantees plan to implement that framework. They will reevaluate and update on a periodic basis, and that's where you'd have all the compliance measures and such for that. for that framework, for that requirement. So those are really the big 4 things that are required of the BEAD program. And then we'll have experts on staff that evaluate these things as they come in during the application review process. And then, of course, as we get into being subgrantees and compliance and grant agreements, we have folks that evaluate this portion of the BEAD program among the many other portions that there are to evaluate for BEAD. Evan, I saw you came off mute. Did you have any specific questions about it
Yeah, I guess my one question is, as you're looking at the application, I always wonder, because the application process, we just sort of submit and then it comes back one way or the other, and insight into there is always awesome. As you're looking at the application process, if someone does have that plan in hand during the pre-application or the submission process and somebody else is not as far along, how does that, and maybe they're competing in the same area for something, does that a factor? I mean, I know it's not necessarily an official part of the grading rubric, but how does that factor in when you're doing the analysis?
Yeah, it definitely isn't a scoring mechanism per se, but it does make us whenever we're doing our review of like the financial, managerial, and organizational capacity of an entity, which is again outside of a project application, having that document in hand is very attractive, right? It's something that it makes us feel more comfortable because we can check that box that, yep, they have this thing, we've reviewed it, it meets the NIST standards, and we can move on. That tells us that there is a managerial and an organizational capacity there that meets the standards of the program, and something that, it's one less thing we have to worry about as we're going through all of these different things and reviewing, again, financial information, resumes. I mean, if you've applied for a BEAD program in any state, you know the amount of information that you have to provide. And again, we have to review it all. So if there's one, if there's a way to make it easier for us to review that information, having that plan in hand and already operationalized, and not waiting until you become a subgrantee, that is definitely something that we look at to make sure that any applicant is going to be a successful subgrantee.
Sure.
So yeah, again, not a cybersecurity expert, and so this is one little piece, but an important piece of the BEAD program. As you can imagine, the BEAD restructuring notice has thrown every state and territory into a little bit of chaos as we work to implement BEAD. So it for those entities that have already applied for the BEAD program, not only in Michigan but in any other state, having as much ready as possible is probably the best advice I can give as every state and territory moves into this next and mandated round of applications for BEAD.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Eric. Great perspective, as we said, and really appreciate you joining us here today. So as we've been teasing all along here, this is our opportunity for getting a little more interactive and opening up the aperture here on the call a little bit to see if there's any questions that popped up along the way. And as Evan said, if for some reason you think of a question after the call and want to reach us after, we'll provide information here at the end on how to do that. But let's take a look and see if we have any questions that have already popped in. Says here, oh, can you provide us something of use besides a big sales pitch? Can you share the top 5 items those you review are lacking? Give us at least one takeaway.
Yeah,
they may have typed that prematurely. I'm not sure.
I can talk about that very, very quickly. The big things that we see from the service providers, the number one thing is the actual management of the documentation and making sure that it's complete and comprehensive. That's the big one. And that one maybe is also likely the most obvious. The second one that we see a lot of is managing insider threat from a control and access standpoint. So, the use of MFA for internal network access systems, access logs for insider resources that are gaining access to that system is another big one. As service providers, often with smaller networking teams, there's a lot of trust internally the NIST standard says trust, but have protections in place where those things can happen. And so the use of shared admin credentials, making sure that you've got policies in place where those are recycled as people leave, making sure that you've got MFA, not just from VPNing in, but also within the system itself. And then having comprehensive ways to deliver that access control is another big one we see within the service provider space. Service providers are really good at some of the practical aspects of cybersecurity, as far as like segregating network traffic, VLANing, making sure all of those things are in place, and making sure that the network, the pathways within the network you use to control the network are segregated from anything that's public facing. Having proper firewall implementations, having all of those things configured and set up so that you're looking at that kind of intrusion detection, intrusion protection systems, IPS and IDS, as those are coming in. It's very different than an enterprise network, because enterprise networks are looking to protect traffic. You're looking to, the people who are using your network for transport have to protect their own traffic. So you're looking to harden your system from a security standpoint so that the system stays up and is resilient. Another thing that we find is oftentimes based around subscriber information and protections of billing systems, where there's a lot of PII. Depending on where you're storing that, how you're storing that, how you're communicating that. There's some sensitive data that we play with as service providers, with name, address, home phone number, even MAC address and IP address can be considered PII and proprietary information. So how you're handling and storing and transmitting that type of data is another big one that we see often has to be shored up a little bit. And some of that's just as easy as this is how we do it, and setting a standard and documenting that.
Awesome, Evan. Thank you very much. That did not sound like a big sales pitch, and it sounded like a lot more than just one takeaway to me.
Yeah.
Well
yeah. Hopefully that was helpful.
Hopefully. Appreciate the question, though. Here's the next question. Did you indicate that the service fees were based on where we are at now and how much needs to be done, or did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, so I can jump in on this one again too. So yeah, absolutely. As we engage through the sales process with either someone from my team or someone from the CCI team, we absolutely look at where people are at. We look at the size of the system. We look at just some high level question and answer. We like to, I always say I like to get my nerds to talk to your nerds during the sales process, so we get a little bit of scope, and we absolutely will provide discounts and base it on as much of the journey that is left. Another thing that we've done is we've started to structure our engagements where there's an upfront component, but then the second part is based on success of the grant application writing and those pieces. So there's we've had several different structures within the fee structure as we've gone through.
Excellent. Thank you, Evan. Let me ask any other questions out there. We don't have any sitting in the chat right now, but give it another second or two here to see if any questions pop up. And again, we'll give an opportunity at the end if you have questions after the call, or if something's a little more complex that you don't want to share in an open forum, we'll provide you an opportunity to get a hold of us.
It does look like a couple other questions came in. One being, after plans are created, when should you start creating implement controls?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll take that from two different perspectives. One, there's a perspective of Bead and implementing the controls in order to comply with Bead, and then there's an impact of kind of sort of just cybersecurity controls in general. In my opinion, the better way to handle cybersecurity implementation is based on risk to your organization rather than acquisition of Bead funds. So the nice thing about this process is we're going to go through and we're going to point out some shortcomings in a standardized approach to cybersecurity. And as business owners, those things carry with them inherent risks that you need to make decisions on. For example, Tim decided to move forward with the Office 365 stuff even prior to us coming in, but our ability to reconfirm that was a significant gap for them, a risk, he pushed that maybe even a little faster to get it done, regardless of Bead. So in my mind, it needs to be a risk-based decision on when you move forward on those things, and it's going to be different for every organization. I would say that if you're going to use the Bead timeline as your implementation timeframe, though, and you're going to stick to that model, identifying which pieces of the gap remediation that your internal teams are going to remediate for you, and those that you plan to outsource are really important. And reaching out and getting those outsourced components in place and scheduled and ready to rock and budgeted for right away can be very useful there. I think that resources can be hard. There's not all cybersecurity implementation teams are created equal. You may end up going through a few before you find the one you want. So start that process right away and incorporate it into your plan. My feeling would be that at a minimum, once you know that you're going to be getting these things, you got to have a plan to drive forward. Hopefully that helps.
Excellent. Yeah.
And I do see a couple other questions, but I'll just ask one more, and I'm going to merge the questions into one.
Sure.
How likely will cybersecurity continue to be a part of future grant programs and will continue to be a priority for Bead? I think Eric touched upon this, saying that he looks for resilient systems, but I'll let the panelists address those questions.
I would be very surprised if there was ever another federal program grant related for within the telecommunications space where the cybersecurity controls weren't a part of it. It's here to stay. You're seeing it in not just this industry. Cybersecurity is an aspect of anything. I personally believe it's here to stay. Eric, I'd be curious to see your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I definitely think it will be here to stay. I mean, Bead, obviously, like I said, Bead is the largest investment that's ever been made in this space. So rightfully so, it's in this program. But as we look to the future, I mean, short term, USDA Reconnect maybe, anything that happens with USF, who knows, the specter of RDOF 2.0 is still out there. I would be surprised, like you said, if it wasn't part of those grant programs moving forward. In any other, maybe even state-based efforts that happen after BEAD, I would imagine that they would pick up on this best practice and implement those too.
I did see that other question come in about for a company that's at a 3 in terms of where they're at, what's a high level budget for becoming compliant and staying compliant? That's a great question. It generally, for someone who's midway through their journey, to become compliant, you're gonna, and again, this is a range. So this is just giving you some ballpark perspective. You're going to be somewhere within the $100,000 to $200,000 range by the time you do licensing, labor, implementation timelines, all of those types of things. But staying compliant, you're going to have some annual licensing fees for the tools you onboarded, things like that are going to raise your costs. And then it's really more about the internal processes to do the reviews and the things that you have to do, both from a supply chain compliance standpoint and talking to your vendors and making sure that they're doing the things they should be doing per your standards. And then also staying attuned to any changes in NIST over time. So the upfront cost is definitely the bigger piece, but I think depending on the size of your organization and the size of your systems and how many checks you need to have individually, you're going to have somebody who's going to spend, a portion of their job every year kind of checking these boxes and keeping you compliant here as you move forward. So I would say, between $100,000 and $200,000 for a small to medium sized service provider, it's generally what we see upfront. And then I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 to $25,000 a year after that. Some of that's going to be sunk cost in your labor if you've got somebody that can do it already, but in just kind of total cost, that's what I would see.
Excellent. Well, all right. I think based on time, we'll move on and we'll answer any outstanding questions separately outside the domain of the call here. So why don't we move on to the next slide if you can? And I'll just wrap things up here quickly because I know we committed to a certain time frame here. I think, when you think about things to take away a lot here, Evan just went through an entire laundry list of them, but, I think it's obvious for those of you just sort of diving into this, there can definitely be impacts to the business that can be critical and vital for sure where cybersecurity is concerned. And I think we also talked about that it's an ongoing process. We were just discussing that. There's continuous review, monitoring. You got to be able to adapt over time as things change. And um, you know, as we were discussing just a minute ago, trust is at the center of all of this. So we need to ensure trust, avoid penalties, and obviously, just in the case of these programs, meet basic standards. So hopefully, we've also been able to communicate that CCI GuideStar can, be a powerful partner to help, your company make sure you have the proper comprehensive support and guidance and expertise to maximize your funding opportunities. And if you want to be proactive, you need help with compliance or understanding what your gaps are and how to fill them, or just need someone to ride sidecar when it comes to the grant process, to get you in position, GuideStar can help. And as we've said multiple times now, it's an ongoing process, and success, really requires continuous monitoring and review, and we can be there along that route as well. So really appreciate everyone joining. Let's go ahead and move to the next final screen here. Yes, thank you very much. So I want to say, first of all, thank you to our panel folks and speakers, Tim, Eric, and Evan. Really appreciate you joining the call and spending some time with us. Definitely want to give another shout out to and show appreciation for ACA Connects for this opportunity. Very much appreciate that. And most importantly, I want to say thank you to everyone who took the time to join the call here today. We appreciate you sharing your time with us. And if you want to learn more, I had a couple folks ask about this, and you want to talk to some of our experts to get additional information. The two best ways to reach out are sales@ccisystems.com, or you can call us direct at 800-338-9299. Either one of those work great. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and have a great day.
Thank you.